This is by far one of the weirdest builds I have on the channel, but weird in a really good way, in that it does everything you want a build to do, whilst being satisfying to use, but doing all of it in the most non-traditional ways. You start getting these throwing knives that chunk down champs in the high end, and the build can chain ignitions really well if you know what you're doing. More than anything else I've done on the channel so far, the how you use this build part is really important, especially if you're not that familiar with ignition chaining, so I'd really recommend sticking around for that. And in the spirit of redoing the first video on the channel, which this build was, let's go for the same tunes too. Here's the quick build. So if you've got some experience with Gunslinger, you can go straight to the mechanics and combos this build uses. Gambler's Dodge, Weighted Throwing Knife, Healing Grenade, Blade Barrage, Knock 'em Down, Gunpowder Gamble, Ember of Empyrean, Torches, Char, Ashes. This is your mod setup, and you need Conditional Finality and Athrys' Embrace as your exotics. For more in-depth descriptions of what makes up the build, let's get into it. I'll start with our throwing knife stuff, which is where our burst damage comes from. Your melee is going to be weighted throwing knife. It deals 1.5 times increased precision damage, and any precision kills you land with the knife fully refund your class ability. Plus, any hits you land with this knife against Scorch targets will cause an ignition. Remember this, it's a big part of the build. For our class ability, we're running Gamblers, which is for throwing knife refunds on dodging near an enemy. And already, we've got resets between throwing knife precision kills refunding our dodge, and our dodge refunding our melee. For our exotic armor, we're taking Athrys' Embrace, which does a few things. It gives our knife a second bounce with added tracking, but what we really care about is that on landing rapid precision hits, we get the strengthened heavy knife buff, which gives our knife 200% increased damage. It also gets unstopped stun and a passive 50 strength whilst the buff is up, but we don't care much about that. And we've got one aspect for our knives too in Knock 'em Down, which does two things. It enhances our super, which is Blade Barrage here, giving it 3 extra knives in the volley, but more importantly, it makes it so that when radiant, throwing knife kills will refund themselves. We're pairing this up with our first fragment Ember of Torches, which gives us 8 seconds of radiant on landing a powered melee hit. Really importantly with this interaction, getting radiant from the same knife that kills a target will fully refund your melee, meaning just for landing a kill, even with no radiant buff, the knife comes straight back. For the rest of the kits, we're building into survivability and chain ignitions. We're running Healing Grenade and Ember of Empyrean as sustainability tools in the kit. Healing Grenade gives us Cure and Restoration, and Ember of Empyrean, on getting solar kills, extends the duration of Restoration and Radiance, with higher tier enemies giving more Restoration and Radiant timer. For the chain ignition part of the kit, we're taking Gunpowder Gamble, where Solar Weapon, Solar Ability, plus Scorch and Ignition kills charge up a meter, letting you throw out a grenade that explodes, causing an ignition. We're also taking Ember of Ashes and Ember of Char here, with Ashes making it so that our sources of Scorch generally apply 50% more, and Ember of Char, where our ignitions spread Scorch to anything hit by them. And lastly, Conditional is really a must in the build. It makes both chaining ignitions and setting up Athrys' way easier. Genuinely, there isn't an alternative. The gun plays such a large part in the build that not using it makes the gameplay flow in ways that just doesn't feel good. With that all out the way, this is the part that's worth sticking around for: how to use the build, combo loops, ignition chains, and gameplay tips. Firstly, the setup has 2 niches: high single target burst damage and chaining ignitions. Let's start with the burst damage because that's the part of the build that's personally the most fun. We're using Athrys' 200% melee damage bonus, and then stacking that with the bonus damage that you get when dealing melee damage to a frozen target. By combining these two things, we go from base throwing knife damage up to 7 times base. To put into context how much damage that is, this is a 4 times honed edge Izanagi with Catalyst and Radiant. It does more than that. So, your base combo: get Athrys' buff, freeze, throwing knife. But because we have Gamblers, we're able to do this combo twice on the same target. I'll go over the mod setup after, but all you need to know here is that we have Harmonic Holster on the legs, meaning Conditional auto reloads itself because it's considered a solar gun on that second shot. So it then goes, get Athrys' buff, freeze, stow conditional, throwing knife, dodge. Get Athrys' buff, freeze, throwing knife. This is enough to kill any champ, but there's still more that can be added into the loop if we have a Gunpowder Gamble up and add our last conditional shot in 2 at the end. The combo then goes Gunpowder Gamble, Athrys' buff, freeze, stow conditional, throwing knife, dodge. Get Athrys' buff, freeze, throwing knife, second conditional shot. Meaning we now bundle ignitions into our combo, which is great for dealing with unstopped champs and adds that are near when we want to do our combo. You can also do a modified version of this combo where you get Athrys' buff, freeze, throwing knife, second conditional shot. This is probably the most amount of bursts you can do in as short time as possible, but it does leave you without a knife, meaning you'll have to rely on your dodge for a reset. It's normally best to try double combo something, but if you're dealing with an overload, for example in a GM, where you need to bundle up as much damage as possible in as short an amount of time, it's great for that. But the amazing thing about all these combos is that if at any point you land a precision kill with your knife, you're going to get both your melee refunded from Knock 'em Down's Radiant reset, as well as get your class ability refunded from Weighted Throwing Knife, meaning it can be done on loop as long as you land a precision kill at some point. So that's the single target damage side. Now let's do the chain ignition part. We're using Ashes and Char, which again makes our sources of Scorch generally apply 50% more and causes our ignitions to now spread Scorch. As for what that actually means for abilities in the kit, Gunpowder Gamble ignitions now spread 60 Scorch, Conditional Second Shot ignition now spread 60 Scorch, Weighted Throwing Knife ignitions spread 60 Scorch, and Incandescent now spreads 40 Scorch, or 45 if it's Enhanced Incandescent. Without overcomplicating this part, what you're wanting to do is apply Scorch to groups of adds, and then either apply another one of your Scorch sources, or Weighted Throwing Knife a Scorch target. As for your combos you can do to get ignitions, Gunpowder Gamble, Weighted Throwing Knife, ignition. Incandescent, Weighted Throwing Knife, ignition. Conditional Second Shot, Weighted Throwing Knife, ignition. Conditional, Gunpowder Gamble, ignition. Gunpowder Gamble, Incandescent, ignition. Although you have to be quick with this combo, because as soon as that Scorch drops below 40, you lose your ignition threshold. How we cause chain ignitions off of these though, is like so. Imagine we throw a Gunpowder Gamble into a group of adds. They're all hit for 60 Scorch now, from Char and Ashes. Then, we Weighted Throwing Knife and cause an ignition on a target. That second ignition will spread 60 Scorch, meaning anything that got hit with the Gunpowder Gamble Scorch will now ignite, with those adds themselves spreading 60 Scorch and chaining it to anything nearby. Basically, by causing an ignition near a target, they get Scorch applied to them, then by causing another ignition on or near that target, they'll ignite, spreading 60 Scorch, chaining it between groups of enemies. And the healthier and tankier adds are that you chain ignitions on, the longer chains can go on for, and the more ignitions get spread. If you want the Spark Notes version, apply Scorch to a group of adds, ignite a target, and then ignitions will ping Scorch around. And that's the mechanics of the build. I know it might sound a bit complicated, but once you get your hands on the build, a lot of this stuff will just click and make a lot more sense. And that leads pretty nicely onto the first tip. You need to put some time into getting used to this build. Out of everything on the channel that I've done, and probably will ever do, this build has the highest skill ceiling I've ever used. You gotta be fast, precise, manage cooldown as well, and this build can feel really bad if not played well. But once you've got it down, it's rewarding like nothing else in the game. It's so nice to have a build where it feels like there's genuine progression to getting better with it. That's something that most PvE builds don't have, but once you nail the loops, it melts champs and clears adds so efficiently in some of the coolest ways. For more gameplay focused tips though, let's start with the knife. It's really important to manage your knife and dodge resets carefully. If you have both a dodge and a knife, you can use the knife for whatever, whether that's chunking down champs or triggering ignitions off of Scorch. It doesn't matter whether you get a kill, but that second knife you get from your dodge, really try aim for that precision kill. It'll give you both your knife and dodge resets, which lets you just do more of what the build is wanting to do. Also, if you can, your knife will give more Gunpowder Gamble stacks, so if you can pretty safely guarantee a knife kill, go for it. It just gives you more ignition opportunities, which is always good. One thing I haven't touched on much yet is your survivability in the build. The setup has good survivability from Healing Grenade and Empyrean, but like everything here, you have to work to make it happen. First is as a panic button, where you just chuck it because you're about to die. But more often than not, you should be using it right before killing a high tier enemy or killing a bunch of ants. Empyrean gives varying amounts of restoration depending on what tier of enemy you kill, so throwing this down before killing a champ, or starting an ignition chain, or just clearing out a bunch of small ants is a nice way to get more restoration. But this is only restoration times 1. Any big amounts of burst damage will kill you, so you've got to be careful. Outside of resist mods, this is your only source of survivability, and losing it leaves you with no healing or damage resist, making playing around keeping your restoration timer high a big priority. One thing that's weird with this build is that it can both work amazingly with teammates, but also can be quite bad when played with teammates. Main reason being that randoms will see frozen enemies, ones you might want to do a combo on, and they'll shoot that ad, and your effective damage will just dip massively. If you're playing with randoms, you've got to be fast with the combo, otherwise there's a good chance they'll mess it up. On the other hand, if you're playing with teammates that can give you restoration, you can keep that going with Empyrean. If you're playing with teammates who can give you damage resist, that stacks really nicely with restoration. Any other builds that can freeze are amazing in setting up Athrys's without relying on conditional so much. In coordinated play, this build thrives better than it does already, but it requires a certain playstyle from your teammates, so it might not always be ideal. At the very least, if you're playing with teammates who know not to shoot frozen targets, that's already enough. And if not, you gotta be quick with your combo. And a quick note on champs, this build deals with unstops and barriers really well from Radiant given anti-barrier, and ignitions and shatters for unstops, but the build has no built-in overload, meaning you're entirely reliant on seasonal artifact mods for that champ. When dealing with barriers, the first conditional shot isn't normally enough damage for them to put up their shield, meaning you can get a barrier down to below half health by doing the Athrys combo, and then use Radiant from landing that combo to break the shield and recombo them. Unstops are super easy, literally just stun and shoot them, but overloads are a bit more annoying. I'll typically go for Athrys, then the second conditional shot, and then finish them because it's enough damage to full kill one. And now, there's even more Scorch and Ignition tech, but this is here for the min-maxers, those who really want to push the build and its interactions to the limits. First tip here, and it's an odd one. Contrary to what you might see on Data Compendium, Ember of Char is actually able to reapply Scorch to the same target it ignites and benefits from Ashes too. For the sharp-eyed out there, of those 6 combos I mentioned before that cause ignitions, you might have seen that some ignitions caused by abilities that directly hit will leave a target that ignited, reapplying Scorch to themselves. But this is your golden rule. The thing that directly causes that ignition has to have made direct contact with the ignited enemy. Take the Incandescent Weighted Knife combo. In this first example, you see that Incandescent gets triggered, hitting the boss and 2 other adds, but then Weighted Knife hits a target near the boss. An ignition goes off from Weighted, and then that ignition spreads Scorch to the boss, causing an ignition, but no Scorch is reapplied to the boss. Then, if we do the same combo, but Weighted Knife hits the boss directly, you see that 60 Scorch from Char and Ashes is added to the boss after the ignition, as it was a direct hit from Weighted. Exact same rule goes for weapons that directly apply Scorch or cause an ignition, meaning conditional can by itself both trigger an ignition on a target and leave them Scorched too. This is why so many freaky deaky YouTubers keep calling their builds infinite ignitions, because of this interaction plus solar fulmination. I'll come back round to that in the seasonal artifact setup in a bit, but where those builds rely on fulmination to be good, much like how Polaris Lance needed Razor Precision and Kindling Trigger last season, this build doesn't because the core focus isn't just ignition chains. But as for why this is important to know, it means one conditional shot and a weighted can fully kickstart an ignition chain, but all from just one target. It's another tool in your arsenal to use, plus Athrys doesn't deal its bonus damage to bosses, so being able to use Weighted Knife for triggering ignitions on those chunkier targets can help claw back some of that lost damage. And the last tip for conditional here, outside of the Athrys combo, that ignition shot is by far the strongest of the two, and by using Harmonic Holster, we're able to consistently have that ignition shot. If you know you're only having to do ag clear, or have a boss that you want to max out your total conditional damage on, you can essentially turn your entire reserves into ignitions. Shoot both your stasis and solar shot, then let harmonic holster load in the solar shot, which will sound like this. Pull conditional out, shoot, then restow the gun and rinse and repeat. It's a great way to get more total damage from conditional. And for your Athrys combo, you'll not only be able to hear that conditional is reloaded from harmonic, but also be able to see it as the gun will switch from solar to stasis. As for your weapons, conditional is fixed in the build, but your primary and secondary have some flexibility. You're always going to have solar weapons as they interact with gunpowder gamble, but for specific archetypes, you're going for a weapon that can land a lot of precision hits quickly. So for primaries, pulses, SMGs, sidearms or autos are nice choices here. Hand cannons at a stretch can work. I know Zaoli's is really popular, so if you're comfortable using that you can, but getting Athrys' buff might be a bit slower. For your heavy though, you can use whatever, but if you want to, you can go for heavies that can land precision hits too, like LMGs or 3-round burst linears. Also, any perks can work here, but incandescent is pretty much mandatory in the build. It sets up ignition chains and makes weighted throwing knife much better. If you've got a gun that has incandescent heal clip, it strikes a super nice balance between survivability and ignitions. A couple of guns that have some specific interactions though are Briar's Contempt, as it gets its weapon trait Harmonic Resonance activated by conditional, and if you're playing with teammates, a no hesitation with Psychic can give you access to Restoration without having to rely on Healing Grenade, meaning you can actually switch in something like Incendiary to help ignition chains while still having access to Restoration. Plus, any guns that have high handling feel nice, that it makes weapon swapping during your Athrys combo feel more snappy and faster. As for seasonal artifacts, if you're watching and it's not episode 1, skip to the timestamp. Otherwise, Elemental Siphon is amazing here. Free fire sprites which drop the cooldown of your grenade is great, and Radiant Orbs gives you Radiant on picking up an orb, which is nice. Most importantly though, Solar Fulmination. It doesn't just give your ignitions more damage and radius as you'd think it'd do if you're going off in-game descriptions. It almost acts like another mini ignition being caused that can spread Scorch, turning combos that would normally just cause one ignition into making 2 or 3. Conditional this season from Fulmination is double igniting on that second shot, meaning that it can by itself cause another ignition on anything standing there. This build by no means has a reliance on Solar Fulmination, but the setup definitely feels a lot more explosive right now, so use this whilst you can, because you'll start getting clips that look like this. You'll also want to take Shield Crush here, as it gives us bonus grenade regen while radiant, so one that's worth picking up too. For your Armour Mods, you're wanting Harmonic Siphon on the helm, Special Ammo Finder, and Hands On. On the arms, you want 1 heavy-handed, 1 impact induction, and 1 grenade kickstart. On the chest, you want Resist Mods and 1 charged up. On the legs, you want a Harmonic Holster for your combos, Recuperation, and stacks on stacks. And on the cloak, you want double Reaper and 1 bomber. For your stat split, you want Resilience, then Discipline, then either Mobility if you feel less confident with the combo and you want Gamblers as more of a safety net, or Intellect if you feel more comfortable with the build and are confident in landing precision knife kills. And that's the entire build. I really recommend trying this one out and sticking with it. I said it before, but that feeling of progressing your skill with a build is something that's really rare now. It just seems that builds are pretty much what you get at face value, whereas this one has so much depth to it that you just want to keep coming back to test out a new combo or try a new interaction. It feels really fun to use, and it absolutely has its place in the high end as a champ killing build and ag clearing setup. That's it from me though, the rest is up to you to go use it and figure out what's what. See ya!